Good afternoon, and thank you for joining me in this session on compliance and creativity, the strategic obligations of directors. I'm Vera Visevic, and I head up the not-for-profit and charity team at Mills Oakley in the Sydney office. Today, I'm going to be presenting on what I've observed as being recent trends in strategy as they relate to the not-for-profit sector in Australia. And the language I'm going to be using is that of boards and directors, but I wanted to explain up front that obviously when I refer to a board, that also includes a committee or some other sort of council. When I refer to directors, that also includes committee members and other sorts of governors. So I'm just trying to keep the language simple, but I hope that you'll be able to see how it applies to your organisation. So let's get started. So I've got on the screen the overview of what I'm going to be speaking about for the next 30 minutes. I'm going to do an introduction about the role of strategy. I'm going to focus on two recent events where I show my theory about the change in the role of strategy, and then I'll finish off with a conclusion. So let's start with a general introduction to strategy. What I've observed in working with not-for-profits and charities these last 25 years or so is that there is a trend in directors of not-for-profit boards appreciating the need to strategize, to develop a strategy for their organisation, which is a good thing. What I've also observed, however, is that there are many boards still struggling with that, and these boards unfortunately tend to revert back to their more comfortable role of focusing on the operations rather than trying to tackle longer-term strategy. Nevertheless, what I've observed overseas with the recent royal commissions and just generally what the community is saying, I'm seeing a trend where it's no longer acceptable for a board to focus on operations, but really there's a call, a mandate, and possibly also a legal duty to start focusing on longer-term strategy. Now, why are boards reluctant to strategize? I've got there on the screen a number of different reasons, and again, these are my own observations as to why boards tend to revert back to their more comfortable terrain of just looking at the operations. A board may suffer from one or more of these reasons, and it's something that, if the board does actually have this problem, they're going to have to start tackling this, because I'm hoping by the end of the presentation that you'll realise that this is no longer acceptable for a number of reasons. Now, with regard to what I've been seeing, and again, as I've said, I'm going to focus on some recent royal commissions and some other community trends, literature I've been reading in relation to cybersecurity, climate change, and even COVID-19, they're all pointing in the same direction. When you also combine that with what we've seen in recent years in terms of community expectations, we're seeing that what's happening is that strategy is taking on a new role. And it's doing this in two different ways. One is that the actual definition of strategy is changing, where boards are now being required to consider people beyond those immediately within the organisation. And secondly, a failure to do this can actually expose the organisation to some fairly serious damage, such as reputational damage or financial damage, and this could then be interpreted to be a breach of directors' duties, resulting possibly in personal liability for the directors involved. Now, when we think about strategy, there is no one definition. I've actually read somewhere there are more than 80 different definitions of what is strategy, and you can start off with something simple, such as the first one there on the screen, where basically we say strategic planning envisions the preferred future that the organisation wishes to realise and sets out to make that future eventuate. Or to put it more colloquially, this is where we are now, this is where we want to go, and this is how we're going to get there. Very simplistic, effective but simplistic. We also have more detailed definitions, which is the second one there on the screen by Bob Garrett, which is much better because it requires the board to take into account both internal and external dynamics. Nevertheless, I still don't think that these definitions reflect these trends that I'm seeing, and I think that we'll have to start thinking about coming up with new definitions. Now, as I've said, I've been studying this trend in a number of different contexts, but because we've only got 30 minutes, this particular presentation is going to focus on some recent royal commissions and some recent literature I've been reading about community expectations. In particular, I'm going to be looking at climate change. And what I've observed with regard to the royal commissions and climate change is that they seem to be impacting on two specific directors' duties. Now, generally, directors of a not-for-profit board or a charity board have up to possibly 6, maybe 7 different specific duties that they legally need to comply with. I have noticed that 2 of those keep coming up with regard to strategy, and they are the more general duty of good faith to act in the best interests of the organisation, and secondly, the duty to act with care and diligence. Just to remind you what those 2 duties are, the duty to act in good faith is to act honestly in the best interest of the organisation for a proper purpose, and the duty of care and diligence requires directors to make decisions in a way that a reasonable person would make those decisions, and again, within the specific circumstances of that organisation. Please keep in mind, with the second duty of care and diligence, we do have what we call a business judgment rule, which basically provides a defence for directors if they've made a decision which later on turns out to be a poor one. You'll find, however, as I move through the presentation, that even that defence may no longer be available to directors who are neglecting or ignoring certain global events such as climate change. So defences that are generally available may not actually be available if directors fail to comply with what the community is expecting of them. So let's start off with some recent royal commissions. As you know, we are now into our 4th royal commission. Funnily enough, or maybe it's not funny, it's I guess sad that we are seeing the same message come out again and again, starting off with the Child Sexual Abuse Royal Commission, then the Banking Commission. We've had the interim report for the Aged Care Commission, again, same message, and we've now got the Disability Commission, and we're seeing the same message. This same message is that there is a growing importance of directors both preparing and committing to a longer-term strategy. Plus, when considering that strategy, when preparing that strategy, they need to start thinking about people beyond the actual legal organisation. And this is becoming so important that it could be argued that it's becoming a quasi-duty of directors. And if directors breach this duty, they could be exposing both the organisation and themselves to liability. So let's start off with the Child Abuse Royal Commission. This report, which went for some volumes, exposed a system which completely failed to consider and protect the vulnerable people that these institutions were actually set up to serve. It showed, amongst other things, inadequate reporting, inadequate complaints handling processes, poor hiring and oversight of staff, and various other issues, which generally evidenced a failure by these institutions to place the needs of the victims above their own reputations. Strategy is, by its very definition, the formulation of a longer-term plan. But what this particular Royal Commission showed was that it was tempting for boards of these institutions to focus on shorter-term success and gains, and usually they're of a financial nature. And what this means is that there becomes then, what's created is a contradiction between the board's tendency to focus on shorter-term gains and the board's obligation to focus on longer-term needs of the people that they're trying to serve. If we think about it, to establish systems, processes, hire appropriate staff, train appropriate staff, have the appropriate IT frameworks that can cope with complaints and so forth, this is a longer-term plan. It requires a board to be willing to sit down and be prepared to spend the time and the money now in order to actually create something that's going to be for the benefit of the people that look after longer term. This flies in the face of what is more tempting for boards, which is to save money now and cut corners now in order to create some gains now, usually financial, but at the expense of the longer-term benefits which they need to be focusing on, especially in the context of looking after the vulnerable people they've been established to look after. So this is obviously creating risk, and as this particular Royal Commission showed, it was a reputational risk, and this then leads inevitably to the risk of directors being personally liable. And if you see there, the last bullet point on that slide, strategizing as a director involves a commitment to doing something now that will enhance the organisation later on. Building in policies and safeguards for the benefit of vulnerable clients is a long-term act that, when pushed to the side or ignored, which is what we saw in this particular Royal Commission, is detrimental to the longer-term viability and success of the organisation. Let's turn to the Banking Royal Commission, which showed similar results and similar practices at an institutional level. Here I'm going to focus on two things. The first thing is the duty of good faith now includes a duty to strategize. The Commissioner said in this particular Royal Commission, a director's duty to act in good faith in the best interest of their organisation is a long-term duty. Whenever you see long-term duty, long-term outlook, long-term plan, that is another word for strategy. As a result, directors must shift away from shareholder, or in the not-for-profit world, member primacy and a short-termism perspective to a customer-centric, longer-term outlook. So this is what the Commissioner said in the final report in this commission. This involves the directors thinking about their practices and how they will affect the long-term reputation and value of the organisation, rather than the short-term success. The second element I want to focus on in this particular Royal Commission is the duty of good faith now involves considering other stakeholders. So this is a duty which is now owed, according to Commissioner Hayne, it is now owed to the organisation as an entirety, and not just to, in the for-profit world, shareholders, in the not-for-profit world, members. We must start thinking about, as a board, according to Commissioner Hayne, all people associated with the organisation. So the customers, the employees, and basically everyone else. And I've said there in this slide, third bullet point, the longer the period of reference, this is the reference that directors are taking into account when making decisions or strategizing, the more the interests of other stakeholders, will be an important consideration when making decisions. Commissioner Hayne also reiterated that directors will not fulfil their duties by only focusing on short-term results. And this isn't something new. If you go back to 2008, we had another judge, Justice Owen, saying a director's fiduciary duties, and by fiduciary mean to act in good faith in the best interest of the organisation, those duties are owed to the company, not just to shareholders, creditors or members. So we're seeing a trend. We're seeing judges, commissioners starting to say, you can't just focus on members. And this is something that I think is probably a result of the law, because the law, especially in the Corporations Act, states that the organisation is made up of directors, the actual organisation and the members, and the Constitution creates a contract between the three of those, and that the duties are owed to the members. And funnily enough, in law, it is often the members who have the standing to actually bring an action against the directors if they fail to do the appropriate thing. The law is expanding, so those duties are expanding, where we as a board, because I sit on a number of boards, we need to start thinking about not just our members, not just the board or the organisation. We need to start thinking about those people we serve, and beyond that, unfortunately or fortunately, the wider community. And this is already happening overseas. So I found that in the UK, their version of the Corporations Act actually states, and this is back in 2006, a director must have regard to the following when acting in good faith: the likely consequences of any decision, the interests of the employees, the need to foster relationships with suppliers, customers, and others, the impact of the company's operations on the community and the environment. There needs to be a focus on reputation and to act fairly. So I wouldn't be surprised if Australian law started changing to start encompassing all those other factors and all those other stakeholders in its description of what a director must consider when acting in good faith in the best interests of the organisation. So, as a summary of the connection between Royal Commissions and strategy, we see that there is a shift happening. The Royal Commissions have shown that directors who don't appropriately strategise by considering the needs of other people will not be acting in the best interests of the organisation, which is our duty of good faith. Why? Because this will inevitably result in some sort of damage to the organisation, be it reputational, financial, or some other sort of damage. This is especially the case if the organisation is working with vulnerable people. There is a need for the organisation to be customer-centric, and this may result in the organisation needing to change everything from the objects in its constitution, to its policies, to its practices, to how it hires staff, to its processes, and so on. There's a lot of literature now on not-for-profit organisations being customer or stakeholder-centric, it's the same term. And the literature is also showing that those organisations that are more customer-centric are actually experiencing better results financially. So it's an interesting trend and it's an interesting phenomenon, and I'm thinking and seeing that it is growing in importance, and not-for-profit boards should start thinking about how they can become more customer or stakeholder centric. Let me give you a fairly recent example. On the screen there, I've got a list of what happened in 2 different aged care facilities during COVID-19 back in March and April. And these 2 aged care facilities are fairly comparable in terms of size. But because of different strategies that they had in place, you'll see that the outcomes of, or the consequences of COVID-19 on these 2 facilities were quite different. If we look at Baptist Care's facility, Dorothy Henderson Lodge, they were much more prepared. They had accommodation which had a layout which separated individuals from each other. This was a result of having experienced flu outbreaks in the past, so they'd learned from experience, and so they're much more prepared when COVID-19 started. They had an immediate response. They had staff assigned to separate wings with residents needing to be quarantined. They tested every resident. They transferred 80% of unwell residents to hospital. They allowed staff to take leave. They hired a connection coordinator to look after the concerns of isolated residents. They've also got a future response. They've employed 110 people as care reserves in the event of another outbreak. They were prepared. They had a strategy in place. They had processes in place. And so the unfortunate consequences of COVID-19 were much less disastrous for them as compared with Anglicare. Anglicare's Newmarch House, which was all over the news, you'll see the stats on the screen, were much worse. They weren't prepared. They didn't have a strategy in place to be able to cope with this pandemic. They had a delayed response, poor communication to families, appeared to have no real action plan, or if they did have one, they didn't really implement it very well, refused to move out a particular resident at the request of the family, and later that week that person died. People were suffering from the lack of very basic care, no showering, getting 2 slices of bread with nothing else for lunch, issuing poor apologies for the treatment that their residents encountered, poor communication to families, and the list goes on and on and on. So what lessons can we learn even from something as recent as COVID-19 and Newmarch? Even though one could argue that the pandemic was unprecedented and unexpected, nevertheless, I would imagine if you're running an aged care facility, you would be prepared for flu outbreaks or some sort of emergency situation. And I think if they had been prepared, the results wouldn't have been as disastrous as they were. They also should have had a strategy in place for any sort of outbreak, being a strategy that focused on residents and the rights of families to know what was happening to their loved ones within the facility. As a result of lack of strategy, lack of planning, and lack of appropriate response to the pandemic, both Newmarch and Anglicare have suffered severe reputational damage as a result, which, from my perspective, as I watch this on the news, appear to escalate. So even at the first outbreak of bad reports about what was happening within this facility, I naively kept thinking that at some point they would quickly deal with it, turn the situation around, and show the community that they're on top of it, but that actually never happened. And what they're probably going to need now as a result of all this reputational damage is a new strategy, both to repair their reputation and to start preparing for any similar sort of situation in the future. So it's going to have to be a long-term strategy with it's going to have to look at, I guess, hiring better staff, having better equipment, having better processes in place, having a better response to any sort of future pandemics that happen or other sort of similar sort of emergencies. So that was the first, I guess, forum or context, these Royal Commissions, where I saw that there was a shift happening or a new trend emerging where directors were being asked to, take strategy seriously and to see it as a duty and to start thinking beyond those to whom they immediately report within the organisation, to both their customers, their clients, and the wider community. The second area where I've seen this develop is in climate change. And with climate change, we all know that this is growing as a global concern, and people who have been studying this have shown that there are now two categories of risks that arise from climate change for directors. So directors need to be aware of both what we call transition risks and physical risks. Transition risks relate to moving to a lower carbon economy. This includes policy, legal, technology, and other changes. And then we've got physical risks, which arise from either event-driven or longer-term changes in climate caused by climate change. And the literature on this is saying that directors need to be much more concerned with transition risks when developing a long-term strategy. I saw this quote and I wanted to include it because I think it shows the literature that's out there, and it shows that beyond the physical and transition risks, people who are studying climate change are also identifying additional risks. So this writer is saying reputational risks from changing consumer behaviour and expectations, loss of corporate customers who demand action on climate change, having stranded assets, having to write down the value of assets that have a high carbon intensity, having products made obsolete, the threat of technological change, the need to adapt through the potential financial impact on assets from severe weather events such as storms, flooding, and bushfires. These are all additional risks that directors need to be aware of and need to be planning longer term about how they actually manage and mitigate the consequences of these risks. To add to this, there was a special counsel, Noel Hutley, and Sebastian Hartford Davis, who wrote an opinion piece on this back in 2016, which they updated in 2019. And their opinion piece is about the acceptance of directors' duties, especially the duty of care and diligence, growing in scope to now include a duty to consider climate change. So Hutley wrote that it's his opinion that the impact of climate change is now seen as foreseeable by the courts. It is therefore a necessary risk that directors must consider when strategizing and making decisions. And this is only added to by the fact that these risks also can result in the tertiary risk of litigation against organisations that don't properly address their impact on the community. So we are seeing this, especially in Australia, even the beginning of 2020 with all the bushfires. And Hutley is saying that the fact that we can now foresee these sorts of events, we can't say anymore that we can't expect them. We don't see them on the horizon. Even just the last few months is showing that we are seeing trends happening, events happening, and we can't plead ignorance anymore. So Hutley is saying that because we can foresee these events. If we don't prepare for these events, then it's an increased likelihood of litigation arising from directors failing to plan for, prepare, and mitigate against the effects of, say, climate change. And this is being supported, this opinion, not only by the community, because obviously there's a lot of community opinion about climate change, but also the regulators such as ASIC. And Hutley goes on to say, a failure to do all of this could be a breach of care and diligence, which we know can result in personal liability for directors. So, to move on to a regulator's opinion, such as ASIC, in 2018, the Commissioner said that he supported Hutley's opinion. He said it was legally sound and that the opinion reinforces the need for directors to adopt a probative and proactive approach when decision-making. So ASIC is saying that they agree with Hutley, and effectively this means that directors need to start thinking about climate change as part of their mandate, as part of their obligation, and this feeds into what they need to be thinking about when they are creating and implementing strategy. And ASIC goes on to say, and as we know, ASIC is the regulator for all the directors' duties, ASIC is saying that we may not be able to rely on the business judgment rule, the defence against a breach of care and diligence, because climate change is so foreseeable. Now, this is all new territory, so this is all quite interesting and something that I think as directors we need to be aware of. The Commissioner of ASIC said, directors need to understand and continually reassess existing and emerging risks that may be applicable to their business and ask the relevant questions of management. This should extend to both short-term and long-term risks and opportunities. And as I've said, when you see long-term, you read strategy. This is yet to be tested by the courts in Australia, but given that ASIC is agreeing with Hutley, I think this is something that not-for-profit boards need to be aware of, because I wouldn't be surprised if in the coming years this actually does become statutory law. Now let's look at what the community expects of not-for-profit boards with regard to climate change. A 2019 study by Amnesty International of over 10,000 18 to 25-year-olds revealed that 41% of that group believed that climate change was the most important issue facing the world. So the community is saying, we expect every organisation, including not-for-profit organisations, to be aware of and to be doing something about climate change. And if we fail to do so, then we could be actually pushing aside or disenfranchising that whole younger generation. And I want to finish off this section by looking at a really fantastic example, which is Patagonia, a social enterprise in the States, which focuses on fashion. They took their obligations seriously from day one. When they developed their strategy, they looked at not only the company itself, but also their employees and the broader community. And they decided that they were going to strategically take climate change seriously and try to be at the forefront of this phenomenon. So I've got there on the screen a number of different initiatives that they developed, which make it very clear to the community that they are taking climate change seriously. And as a consequence of taking this stance on climate change, in 2015, they reported that they had tripled their profits since 2008. So obviously, their strategy, their position on climate change is resonating with the community and is actually resulting in increased sales, which I think is support and encouragement for not-for-profit boards to start thinking about these issues beyond the typical day-to-day issues that not-for-profit boards generally think about. So what can we learn in conclusion about climate change? We can learn that the community is expecting organisations, especially not-for-profits, to be proactive about climate change and to make climate change a part of their broader strategy. And this feeds into directors' duties of good faith and care and diligence. And if we also, and there's a further benefit, if we actually build climate change into our strategy, then we also have the added benefit of attracting more clients, supporters, donations, and funding. So it's a win-win from a legal perspective, from a strategic perspective, from a community perspective, and I think also from a financial perspective. So in conclusion, I want to finish off by saying that Our study has shown that boards can no longer shy away from being strategic. If nothing else, COVID-19 has shown that to us. There was a recent report that came out a couple of weeks ago from Social Ventures Australia and Centre for Social Impact, which showed that NFP boards which had failed to plan longer term and have appropriate reserves in place are now in dire financial need. The studies show that 25% of charities were operating with a surplus of less than 5%. So a failure to plan ahead, a failure to be prepared for these sorts of events is now resulting in at least 25% of charities not having sufficient surpluses, and I think some 17% of charities probably closing shop for the next 3 or 4 months. So we need to be strategic. We need to be courageous in formulating strategy and implementing strategy. Strategy is becoming so important, and one could argue it's now become a quasi-legal duty. And we need to understand that strategy is no longer thinking about just our members. We need to consider the wider community. We need to consider those who we are serving, especially if they're vulnerable. If we fail to do that, one day it could actually result in both the organisation being sued and directors being personally liable. And so this is something that we need to seriously consider and implement as part of our board meetings and our strategy. So thank you very much.